Big Dumb or Funny Live PD Moments. Did you just call me a goat head? Part 1. Most moments of policing are not all that funny, but occasionally some are downright hilarious or just dumb. Especially if you try to keep up with live PD episodes. As the cameras follow these dedicated officers on duty, viewers are always left in a state of suspense as anything could happen at any given moment. Some encounters seem pretty dumb to even be real-life situations, posing questions on whether the show is scripted. All we know is that the following episodes delivered some of the best laughs and WTF moments that spice up reality television. Number 5. Layering is key. Police got a call from one of their local sports stores that a male and 2 females were possibly involved in theft as they were concealing merchandise by trying to put it on and then walk out of the front door. The idea was to catch them in action or trail them outside the store if they'd already made their way with the items. On arrival at the store, the suspects were still inside and one had been apprehended by another police unit while the other 3 were in the fitting rooms. The first to come out of the fitting room was a woman who was unsuspecting that police officers were waiting for her outside. When asked to step aside, the woman was in confusion at first, probably scared that her cover had been blown. She was then received by a female officer who proceeded to frisk her. Shortly after, another woman came out of the changing room. This one was evident that she'd piled stacks of clothing under her huge jacket. The third suspect, who was a male, was caught red-handed as officers witnessed him put on a second pair of jeans from the lower door opening. When he got out, he was left speechless to find officers waiting for him. They apprehended him and had him cuffed before he could tense up, and all he said was, "Haven't even left the damn store." The officer then clarifies that it was already an offense that he was concealing, and it was all the state required to have them charged. On checking the items in his pile, one of the officers noticed that he'd swapped his old shoes with a new pair, yet adamantly denied the claims. His accomplices weren't having a pleasant time either. One of the women who'd worn stolen shorts was shocked to find out she was heading to jail. The officer remarks, "Did you say you are going to jail?" "Yes, if you steal stuff, you go to jail." Ouch! The male suspect, who had been taken outside for further questioning, had worn over 10 t-shirts under his hoodie, and the officer sarcastically asked if it was extremely cold. One of the officers tries to explain his possible charges depending on the items he stole from the store, as he seems to comply. Probably the whole time this guy just wanted the ground to swallow him and wake up from that bad nightmare. Who goes all the way from Mariana to Tallahassee just to steal clothes? That's not all. Despite being busted in the act, he claimed that he only did it because his stuff had been stolen and was only trying to replace some of them. When asked why he never visited a nearby store, he didn't shy away from stating that there's no decent store in Mariana. Number 4. Go ahead or goat head. Sometimes a simple misunderstanding is all it takes to spark up an unnecessary fight. Like this scenario of a female officer confronting an intoxicated man who thought she'd called him goat head. Officers got a call for possible trespassing, which involved a man getting into a neighbor's compound, yet he wasn't supposed to be there, so they wanted to confront him and see what his motives were. The man who called in the police says the suspected man was on his knees trying to look into his house and wanted to know if he could help him with something, but he wasn't responsive. The officer found the said man lounging outside a porch in the dark looking rather intoxicated and was wet. When she asks him what's going on, he responds, "Nobody." She proceeds to ask again, "What are you doing?" He replies, "I'm not doing nothing." The officer continues to interrogate the man on why he was all wet, but he seemed clueless and only said, "Nothing." When asked if he lived around there, he claimed to live right at the back. However, when asked what street, a moment of silence followed before asking why he was being prosecuted. The officer cuts him short and explains that she wasn't prosecuting him, but instead wanted to know why he was trespassing. When asked for his name, he responded with John. John Doe maybe? Who knows? Because when the officer asked for some ID, John couldn't produce and it ended up in miscommunication. As the officer says, "Okay, go ahead," John hears, "Okay, goat head," which sparks him up and tells the officer not to call him a goat head. Luckily, she clears the tension by repeating her statement, which calms John down. Since he didn't produce an ID, he tries to read out a number that the officer suspects is someone's phone number. At this point, John wasn't complying and asked the officer why she was being such a pain. No matter how she was trying to explain that she wanted to help the man, he insisted that he was already home and wasn't looking for any help. To prove this, the officer threatened to knock on the door and ask whoever was inside if he lived there. This clueless man wanted to know why officers were at his house, and he's notified that people called in the police after he was spotted walking through their yards and looking inside their homes. John was only trying to get home, and luckily the woman inside the house proved that he was telling the truth. The guy probably had too much to drink and wanted to make sure he was in the right house. Moral of the story, don't be a John and drink responsibly. Number 3, I want my burger. As officers try to mitigate an argument between a mother and son, a burger is used to symbolize truce. According to the officer, some yelling and banging were going on inside the motel room. As the episode begins, some curse words can be heard from a distance. Just as the officer walks towards the room where there seemed to be a fight, a guy jerks out sweating profusely. All he was saying was, "My mom, she's acting," before realizing his clothes were still inside the motel room. He seemed genuine as he explained that he'd come to visit his mom after a month of not communicating. The officer tries to get the man's name, but he's delusional and is only thinking about the events that had transpired, including the frosty he'd gotten his mom, only to be thrown to the ground. When asked what they were fighting about, he clarifies that there was no fight taking place, just that he'd arrived as his mom was having an argument with another person, and he was only a witness. As another officer joins to interrogate him, he shares a similar statement that he brought his mom a frosty and only wants his clothes and hamburger so he can leave. As the officer notices some blood on the man's hands, he gets concerned about whether there might be any casualties in the room. The guy explains that it happened as a scratch from earlier on as he pushed the door, insisting no one got physical. As the officer leaves him to get back to the motel room, the guy reminds him to get his butter burger. The whole time, that's all he was concerned about, despite the yelling that was still ongoing inside the room. Once his mother opened the hotel door, she immediately drew back after witnessing cameras demanding the officer to get a warrant before finally agreeing to let him inside as she wouldn't come out. All the officer wanted to do was clarify that no one was hurt and it wasn't a battery case. The woman was heavily intoxicated and could explain the rowdy behavior. Her son, who was outside, insisted that he just wanted his butter burger. We could hear her say, "Who? What? Oh Lord have mercy," as the officer at the door smiled. She gladly passes the burger to an officer who hands it over to the man outside before he picks his clothes up and leaves the scene. The officers found it hilarious that the man was least concerned about the chaos that was going on and was only caring for his burger. Probably the guy just had munchies. Number 2, play it to prove it. An officer asks a man carrying a guitar case at night to play the instrument and prove it's really his. The whole thing was hilarious to watch because everyone was eager to see if the man indeed knew how to play the guitar. It was one of those scenarios where you play for your life. Officers had gotten a tip to assist one of their plainclothes colleagues who was doing surveillance in the area and had noticed a suspicious man carrying a guitar case and a duffel bag and wanted help interrogating him. As the backup officer stopped the guy, he seemed clueless as to why he was being targeted by police, but gladly complied. At first, he was nervous because he was in possession of some needles which had been used for black tar. Luckily, there wasn't enough on him to have him charged for possession of controlled substances. As he sat by the sidewalk, the officer scuffles through his bag and halfway through, he remembers to ask, "Can I check your bag?" The whole scenario was hilarious to watch because it was like watching a 14-year-old in the body of a 40-year-old man due to his general character and language. After the awkwardness passed, another level of awkward was unlocked when the officer asked about the guitar in the man's possession. He claimed to have purchased it online for $150, but the officer wasn't buying his story, so the only way to prove it was his was to have him play something to convince them. The guy gladly did, and it was one of the most priceless things to watch. He was then released and told to stay off the streets at night, which got me thinking, is it a crime to be out on the streets at night? Number 1, gas gone wrong. Disclaimer alert, if you're eating anything or thinking about grabbing something to eat, well now wouldn't be a great time. A man had been reported to be highly intoxicated to drive himself home and needed help from officers to ensure he got there safe. However, when they arrived on the scene where they'd been called, the said man had defecated on himself due to the high intoxication. What's worse was that it didn't happen once, but twice. The owner of the house was very disappointed and had had enough of the gross encounter. She explained to the officers that the man had messed her walls and even messed part of her kitchen floor. Even though the cameras never showed us the grotesque sight, we can only imagine how foul her house smelt after the ordeal. When the officers interrogate the man, he tries to explain himself but isn't able to do it very well due to his intoxication levels. He claims the woman is a clean freak and chased him out of her house since she didn't want him staying there. When asked if he used the bathroom on himself, he doesn't deny the claims but proceeds to claim he only had a little gas that went overboard, and it wasn't as dramatic as the woman had put it. However, the pants he'd messed on before changing to new clothing had a different story to tell. Despite the officers gladly agreeing to take him home, they had to make sure he'd cleaned himself well and even put a blanket on the seat just in case his gas decided to go overboard. Before getting into the police car, he was trying to pick something from the pocket in a bag with his dirty pants, but the smell was so foul that the officers had to step back and warned him against picking anything. The officer to drive him home even said, "I don't want that in my car." Which one of our picks shocked you the most or made you laugh the most?